All right. Hello, everyone. I hope you're all doing well. I'm going to introduce our speaker today. It's Dr. Elizabeth Wrigley-Field. She's an assistant professor of sociology and a faculty member of the Minnesota Pop Center at the University of Minnesota. She previously held a position as a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Health and Society Scholar at Columbia University. And before that, she received her PhD in sociology at the University of Wisconsin in 2014. I hope this is okay, Elizabeth. Before I get too deep, I thought I would mention, if you're curious about her last name, there's actually a write-up about her on the USA Today sports page online from, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago with more details that's interesting. So she can maybe avoid answering some of those questions in the on the one-on-ones. Dr. Wrigley-Field has received multiple awards for her work, including a recent Outstanding Article Award from the ASA section on mathematical sociology. She's gotten poster awards from PAA 7 different times, I think, if my count is correct. Her work's been funded by the RWJ Foundation, NSF, and others. And she's published in leading general science, population, and health journals, including PNAS, Science Advances, Demography 4 times, and Health Affairs. I'm really excited about this talk. Her research is extremely timely, examining racial inequality and COVID mortality, questioning existing models of vaccine equity, and analyzing multiple geographic aspects of the pandemic. Today, her talk is going to be on racial disparities in the 1918 flu mortality, what drove them, and what can we learn for today. So it's my honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Elizabeth Wrigley-Field.
Thank you so much. That was a really nice introduction. While I get my screen share going, which I'm on an unfamiliar device due to some absurd tech difficulties, and actually my share function has disappeared. I wonder if I no longer have that power. Oh, there we go. Sorry. While I get the slides up, the short version of why my name is as it is that my mom is Wrigley and my dad is Field. Can you all see the slides now?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm going to show some fairly new research. We just submitted this last week to a journal and haven't gone through revisions or anything like that stage. So I guess you could call it medium new. And it's on racial disparities in the 1918 flu pandemic in US cities. This work was jointly led by me and by Martin Eierman, who I really want to give full credit to. He's a grad student at Berkeley in sociology. He's on the market now. He's a wonderful collaborator on this. And we also had this great research team with 4 others as well. This was really a joint effort. So let me start by setting the scene. The 1918 flu is really distinctive for at least 3 reasons, and 2 of those are very well known. It was an incredibly virulent flu, and it also had this super weird W-shaped age pattern where young adults were hit really hard, which is unusual, along with the really traditional young people and old people that usually characterizes flu mortality. And alongside these, the third trait is not well known. Against a backdrop of really extreme racial inequality in mortality at this era, racial disparities in 1918 pandemic mortality were actually surprisingly small. And the fact that something weird was going on was actually known at the time, as this quote from this prominent Black minister makes clear. He said, "During these terrible weeks while the epidemic raged, God has been trying in a very pronouncedly conspicuous and vigorous way to beat a little sense into the white man's head, has been trying to show him the folly of the empty conceit of his vaunted race superiority by dealing with him just as he dealt with the peoples of a darker hue." So people at the time definitely understood that something strange was happening. And this is also analyzed in a small amount of existing research, which is kind of shown on the right side of the screen here, but it's mostly been forgotten in the story of 1918. So I want to start by just underscoring that this really is a surprising pattern. For one thing, it's really different from the rest of this era. So for example, James Feigenbaum, Chris Moeller, and I have this work, which we're now expanding with Lauren and Velasco in various ways, but it's showing that racial inequality during this era generally was so extreme that white mortality during the 1918 pandemic, this kind of once in a century high mortality experience, white mortality then was actually less than Black mortality was every year through 1920. This is infectious mortality specifically, I should have said. So this was unusual for its time. It's also unusual compared to what's happened today during the COVID pandemic. So for example, similar to the era surrounding 1918, in our era, racial inequality is still quite extreme. As an example, I showed that white mortality during 2020 was less than Black mortality has ever been, much like the era leading up to 1918. But unlike 1918, the COVID pandemic intensified disparities. So for example, the age-adjusted Black-white disparity in 2019 was 1.18. In 2020, it was 1.34. And the age adjustment today matters a lot. It's actually not going to turn out to be so important looking back to 1918, when Black and white age patterns in cities were much more similar than they are today. Okay, but so this is telling us that pandemics can make racial disparities worse, as they have been in our own recent experience. And in fact, in a lot of public health and population health kind of research circles, people talk about this like it's a truism, that pandemics make existing inequalities worse, they intensify them. And so one way to think about what I'm going to show you in this talk is, well, let's see what we can learn from an important and kind of conspicuous exception to that generalization. So we're going to start out by just providing the first description of racial disparities in pandemic mortality for all of the cities that had race-specific data. And this is building on earlier research that's looked at racial disparities with other data, insurance data or military data or data from particular cities, but not all together. These are non-white to white flu and pneumonia mortality ratios for cities from 1910 through 1921. So when I say non-white here, that's how the data were collected. Actually, the way it looks in the vital records is the categories were white or colored. But in cities in this era, non-white basically meant Black, just a couple of exceptions in the West. And so we're basically going to use this as a measure of Black mortality. And we look at flu and pneumonia together because most people who died of the flu in 1918, their actual proximate cause of death was pneumonia. So what I want you to see here is, first of all, those 1918 disparities are far smaller than other years. And second of all, there's extremely little variation in them. They're actually almost uniformly small. And this is happening because the 1918 flu is raising white mortality by a factor of 3. Sorry, non-white mortality by a factor of 3, but it's raising white mortality by a factor of 5. So that's the kind of descriptive fact that I'm now going to spend the rest of this talk trying to see if we can explain and see what can we learn from this. So at this point, having shown you like this is the results that everything is geared toward, I should probably now back up and tell you a little bit more about where this fact comes from, some of the measurement issues. So in this paper, we end up drawing on these 11 different data sources that we use for one purpose or another. But the workhorse here is a series of annual race-specific, cause-specific data that came from the Department of Statistics. This is the part of the Vital Statistics series. It's limited to cities that were in the death registration area, which basically meant the Department of Commerce trusts you to provide accurate information. And that did not include the entire United States until 1933. Importantly, though, in the city data, there were cities from states that were not yet included as a state. So as an example, Texas doesn't join the death registration area until 1932, but back in 1918, there were 6 Texas cities in the data set. So we end up with 70 total cities in these data that have these race-specific, cause-specific data. What we get from this data set is counts of deaths. And so we're using these counts of flu and pneumonia as our flu deaths. And to make death counts, obviously, into death rates, you need a denominator. And there things get a little bit trickier. So normally what we would want to do is interpolate census data from 1910 to 1920 and get a 1918 measure, and that would all be straightforward and fine. But the problem is that the 1920 population was actually really distorted by the pandemic. A lot of people died, a lot of people moved out of cities. We do not want to read that backward to get our estimate of 1918 populations. And so the measures I'm going to end up showing you use a denominator that is the population interpolated from 1910 to 1930. But if you know anything about this era, you will be thinking to yourself, wait a minute, migration patterns were really different in the 1920s compared to the 1910s. We instituted immigration controls in 1921 that radically changed the white migrants, the populations that were coming. The Great Migration of internal Black migrants was intensifying. Do we want to interpolate those changes backward to 1918? No, we do not. And so to see how big of a problem this is, we also made this alternative denominator that is based on predicting the population size from the non-infectious death counts, which we have reported annually. And so specifically what we're doing is we're estimating these race-specific regressions of the population size on the non-infectious death counts with some other stuff in there, some city fixed effects, some linear time trends. But we're doing that between 1906, which is the first year when there are race-specific death counts, and 1910. And that's because we can have these sort of true population measures interpolated from the 1900 and 1910 census with no distortion from 1920 from after the flu. So we get these regressions, and then we use those to predict these race-specific populations out of sample for 1918. But when we do that, we don't want to use the actual non-infectious death counts from 1918 because the pandemic is probably going to muck things up. There's social distancing, there's competing risks. So instead, we use the 1915 to 1917 average as our predictor, and we get these alternative population count estimates. Now, there are a lot of things that are questionable about this measure. Probably the strongest assumption that it's making is that the non-infectious death rates were declining at a steady pace from 1906 to 1917. But there's some other problems too. The cause of death reporting changes between 1909 and 1910 in some kind of consequential ways. So if this were our main measure, I would actually be very worried about it. But the virtue of this measure is that the assumptions it's making are really different from the assumptions of our main measure. Which is really about, the direct determinants of population growth, including migration, not changing too much. And so the good news is these two denominators give kind of absurdly similar results about racial disparities. And so basically the upshot is this made me feel, it made us feel confident that we could go ahead with our main measure and not worry about it too much.
Back you up
There's
for a
one.
second and ask.
Is that a question?
This is a question. This is Don Tryman asking a question. And that is, I
Oh.
want to back, I'm sorry?
Sorry,
I
go
want to
ahead.
back up slightly and go to your set of 70 cities. You haven't said anything at all about possible bias in the distribution of cities. Could you tell us a little bit about the extent to which, say, southern cities are included? And I'm sure you've thought about this, but could you tell us how representative the cities are of, say, all large cities or all cities or whatever?
Yeah, this is a very good question. So in the death registration in general is tilted disproportionately toward Northeastern and Midwestern cities because they were bigger and they had more functional bureaucracies earlier on to do the death counting. But because we're using a race-specific series, it's actually different from that. In order to be included in the race-specific series, your population at the previous census had to be at least 10% non-white. And because of that, what we have actually is disproportionately southern cities and disproportionately larger cities that were migration destinations in the Northeast and Midwest. And what we don't have is the smaller, overwhelmingly white cities in the Midwest in particular. And so I think when I'm talking about these racial disparities, it actually is a helpful reminder to keep in mind that we're really talking about disparities in urban populations that were in relatively diverse cities. And the question of how that translates to very different kinds of cities is sort of open.
Thank you.
Okay, jump in again if that didn't answer the question, or if you want to say more about it. I want to show one more descriptive fact at this stage that's going to end up being important later. And it's that these small aggregate disparities are really driven by small disparities in those crucial young adult ages where mortality really jumped up during the flu in this sort of surprising way. So essentially the small disparities are happening because white mortality in these 20s and 30s ages was so extreme. So we want to know why this was happening. We consider a bunch of different candidate explanations. Actually, four main explanations that we put in two categories. And the first category I'm going to dispense with pretty quickly, which is city level factors. So we wondered whether things like cities' adoption of non-pharmaceutical interventions, which is things like quarantines, school closures, might have had race-specific effects, and also whether segregation might have inadvertently protected non-white populations. Because this is not where we find anything interesting, I'm going to give you just like a high-level summary here before I move on to our other contenders. But I do want to say that these hypotheses are not crazy. So like thinking about NPIs, for example, they certainly were unique to 1918. Past research has shown that they mattered, while public health responses that cities organized were typically quite racist. For example, cities in both the North and the South opened whites-only hospitals and clinics during the pandemic. But even so, there were also at the time some fairly robust networks of Black municipal reformers who pushed back against that. And we thought that, well, even if cities are only really trying to respond to the pandemic for white populations, they might have ended up disproportionately helping urban Black populations in the same way that, like, we know from Werner Troskin's work, sewage systems did in the South, just because the Black population was otherwise at such extreme risk. So we used historical newspaper records. We found the timing and duration of these NPIs for 52 cities. And when it comes to total mortality, our results accord with other studies that find that NPIs generally did reduce mortality, but only somewhat. And as a fun digression, the reason they didn't reduce mortality more is that they weren't sustained for long enough to really matter a lot. And the reason they weren't sustained is that they came in for ferocious resistance. So here's a find from that archival research. This is a newspaper article in Topeka. Both the health commissioner and the health officer have been the target during the last few months for gobs of criticism and insubordination against what was termed the autocracy they were establishing in depriving the citizens of the privilege of freedom of action, the right to mingle with flu germs. And to be fair, part of the context here is that this guy, Clark, was already widely hated by everyone. A few weeks earlier, he'd been resoundingly mocked in the same newspaper for saying, "How can you expect the common people to heed influenza warnings when our socially best people sometimes show just as little sense about such things?" So anyway, everyone hated this guy, Clark, but there was a lot of, the point is there was a lot of resistance to NPIs. And as a result, they weren't sustained that long, and their effects on mortality was attenuated, but also real. Even so, though, we find no effect on disparities. So the mortality reduction was very similar for white and non-white populations. And the same thing was true for other city traits, segregation, also some other 1918 mortality risk factors like air pollution. Sometimes they matter for total mortality. They never seem to matter for the disparities across cities. And we don't think they're explaining the variation across years either. So what we've ended up exploring is a different kind of explanation, what we're calling social immunology. I mean, we didn't make that phrase up, but that's how we're summarizing them. And these are the explanations where I want to focus. And the backdrop here is that the urban white and non-white populations in 1918 had very distinctive social histories. The white population was spread around the country. It included lots of people born in the US, many of them born in cities, and especially in the Northeast and the Midwest, it also included many immigrants. The non-white population was disproportionately Southern and disproportionately Black internal migrants, people born into deeply impoverished agricultural settings who then migrated to cities, first in the South, and then from there, increasingly northward. Once in cities, they were made by law and by violence to live in truly appalling conditions, just intensely crowded, dilapidated housing. And so rural origins, but then the worst that cities had to offer. That is a very particular life course history of exposure. And we think that very particular history might have mattered. And so we want to see if these distinctive exposure histories offer the possibility of explaining the small disparities in 1918 through the intersection of the social history of each of these racial groups with the natural history of the 1918 virus. So what do I mean by that? The details of these like 6 distinct variants on these social immunological hypotheses that we consider are complicated. We will not get into all of these details. The basic story is simple. Non-white people were either more likely to have had an earlier flu exposure that was protective, or they were less likely to have had an earlier flu exposure that was harmful. But the details of these hypotheses trade on 2 very distinctive biological features of the 1918 virus. One is that 1918's virus had a relatively mild spring wave before evolving to become more virulent and then having this super deadly fall wave, which is when virtually all the deaths were concentrated. And that raises the possibility that early exposure could have conferred partial immunity. So to the extent that non-white populations had exposure early in 1918 because of these intensely dangerous and crowded conditions that they lived in, they might have been somewhat protected when the virus evolved. This is the only hypothesis in the existing literature about racial disparities in the flu. It was put forward by the historian Alfred Crosby. And he didn't offer any empirical evidence for it, but he pointed out that this could account for what was then the fairly anecdotal explanation that racial disparities in 1918 seemed to be surprisingly small. And the other distinctive feature is that the 1918 flu happens to have some combinations of antigenic similarities and differences to a very aggressive flu that had circulated around 1890, which is sometimes called the Russian flu, although like all of these geographic flu names, that's fictional. And I'll say more about how this might have mattered through a mechanism called immunological imprinting. But first I want to talk about the spring wave hypothesis. So this partial immunity idea. This hypothesis turns on 2 facts. So is it true that non-white populations had more flu exposure in the spring of 1918? And is it true that this exposure was protective? And we can kind of, sort of test each of these with a lot of caveats. So we do not have any real measure of flu exposure or flu cases in 1918. What we do have is a very limited data series of monthly cause-specific, race-specific mortality data for just 20 cities. And using that, we find that non-white flu and pneumonia mortality in the spring of 1918 was much higher than white mortality And so to a degree that even accounting for likely higher case fatality in non-white populations, we think it's very likely that non-white populations really did have more exposure in the spring. And that's not too surprising, again, given these really appalling conditions that people were living in. So the real question is, well, what does this imply for mortality when the fall wave hit? And in general, we find that it actually didn't seem to mean that much. So what we want to find here to sort of like offer some evidence for this hypothesis, we want to see that cities that had a worse spring wave had a better fall wave, higher mortality in the spring, meaning lower mortality in the fall. We don't see that in total mortality or in white mortality, either unadjusted or adjusting for like city fixed effects across years for how bad their flu seasons tend to be generally. We don't see that in total or in white mortality. We do see it, in fact, we see the opposite, right? Where cities that had a worse spring wave tended to have a worse fall wave too. But we do see this pattern in non-white mortality. That's the negative slope in the pink line on the right. So that's what we see. I want to pour a lot of salt on these results for several different reasons. And it's worth saying, like, we actually had a lot of debate on our author team about how valuable these results are. And I was kind of at the more skeptical end of the spectrum, but my co-authors made some good points, and I'm interested in how this plays with you. So, and their argument is basically like, look, these results are not even in the right direction, and that says something. And I think that's true. But here are some things that you might worry about. First of all, with just 20 cities, these models are really underpowered. Second, the lack of case data adds noise, and if case fatality differed across cities in systematic ways, it potentially adds some bias to the results. And then also you'll notice here that the white and non-white spring wave mortality distributions barely overlap. You can see this on the right, on the x-axis there. And so maybe what we're seeing here with these different results is a real protective immunity effect that's only detectable at very high levels of population exposure, which would mean that this hypothesis could be right, this partial immunity. We also started to wonder, though, if this could reflect a behavioral response, where communities that had already experienced the flu as deadly in recent memory were more likely to embrace social distancing. Because non-white communities were so badly served by the medical system at this time, there were these separate public health initiatives that were promoted through Black newspapers, things like what they called health weeks, where there would be these concerted campaigns to raise awareness of health behaviors and emerging public health knowledge. And so we wondered whether maybe Black newspapers actually played a role in generating more cautious behavior in fall 1918 that could have actually been very protective. This behavioral idea is sheer speculation. We did not collect any data that bear on this. Just like Alfred Crosby kind of threw out the partial immunity hypothesis without any evidence, like we're offering this twist on it in the same very general spirit. But at the end of the day, I think what we can say is at least this. There was no empirical support for the spring wave hypothesis before we did our study, and there's not really any support afterward either. Whether you think we provided evidence against it, I'm very curious to hear. Okay, so the last idea I want to talk about is that immunological imprinting idea. And let me first just explain it in some more depth. So this idea turns on a particular history of circulating flu strains. It's kind of the leading hypothesis that comes from this guy, Michael Warraby, who's a virologist. And the basic upshot is that from the 1890 pandemic, for the next 10 years or so, the flu strains in predominant circulation were an H3 strain. The 1918 flu was an H1 strain. And one thing about H3 and H1 is that they're phylogenetically distinctive flu groupings. And so the idea is that people whose first flu exposure in their early childhood was to this 1890 strain, their immune systems were then really primed to fight the wrong flu. So then when they come into contact with the 1918 flu, they are flooded with antibodies that can't actually defeat the virus. They develop these cytokine storms as their body is just producing more and more ineffective immune response. And that this is a very deadly situation. So this basic picture of 1918 vulnerability stemming from early childhood exposure to the 1890 pandemic, that has been developed by people like Michael Werby, like the demographer Alan Gagnon, as a way to explain the high mortality of young adults in 1918. So that really weird age pattern. This is one hypothesis about what was driving it. But we think that it could imply that urban non-white populations, which disproportionately did not grow up in cities, but in rural areas, might have been relatively spared this harmful childhood exposure, while the white population that disproportionately grew up in cities was more exposed. And so this is the hypothesis that we, the last one that we test, and it is worth saying here that when I say test, that's very loose. We do not have any single good test of this hypothesis. What we want to do is just kind of think about what it implies across very different data domains and try to test those one by one and triangulate. So, keep your expectations in check, but that's what we do. And so specifically, we come up with these 5 things that we think all have to be true for 1890 imprinting to explain the small 1918 disparities. The disparities have to be driven by the right cohorts. Non-white members had to have actually had less flu exposure in 1890. Exposure in 1890 should be associated with worse outcomes in 1918. That imprinting effect would have had to be sufficiently prevalent in these cohorts to drive this really extreme mortality effect. And it would have had to be sufficiently harmful to drive this mortality effect too. And so we're going to offer some very limited tests of each of these. So first of all, were the small exposures driven by the right cohorts that could have plausibly had this imprinting effect? The answer is yes. Remember, I told you that these age patterns would matter later. It really is the 20s and 30s. About 3/4 of the small disparities are concentrated in those ages. What can we say about first flu exposure? We don't have any direct measure of who was exposed to the 1890 pandemic. So we're going to use urban origins as a proxy for your chance of being exposed in 1890. And using that, we can kind of say something. So basically, we confirm that it's true that non-white, that urban white populations were more likely to have spent their childhood in cities than urban non-white populations were. And we also find that even with the really noisy and highly imperfect measure of urban origins, which I'll tell you all the problems with if you want, even with that, it is true that cities whose populations had more urban origins had worse outcomes in 1918. And this is using linked census data to try to estimate urban origins. But again, there's a lot of complications in the estimation of that. So, I mean, that's what we find. Urban origins do predict worse outcomes in 1918 and at the city level, and they were more common for white populations. And that concludes our empirical analyses. So like I said, it's limited. But we also want to do some simulations to try to think about, would the parameters that you would need in order to get imprinting effects at the population level that are so powerful that they could explain these small disparities, are those parameters even remotely plausible? So for example, one question that we try to answer is, could that huge jump in young adult mortality for whites compared to the surrounding ages, could that plausibly be driven by imprinting? how big would the imprinting effects need to be, and how many people would it need to be happening to? And the answer is the imprinting effect would need to be very, very, very powerful unless imprinting was close to ubiquitous in the white population in these cohorts. And so then we want to know, well, is it actually plausible that imprinting could have been so ubiquitous, like close to universal among white people aged 25 to 2019 to 29 in 1918, for example? Is that really plausible? And so then we try to back out, well, how high would the historical flu transmission rates have needed to be to end up with this kind of ubiquitous imprinting rates in the white population? And actually at the low end, they're not crazy. They're in line with historical pandemic flu attack rates to a degree that we did not expect. So the simulation here is pretty simple. It's just a giant multi-state life table over a big parameter space with just widely differing rates of exposure to the flu before 1890 and the flu during 1890, just to see like what combinations can produce the right imprinting rates. And the other thing I want to explain from this graph is just that the refocusing rate that's mentioned here, this is this idea that Alan Gagnon has put forward that says, you know, well, maybe the 1890 flu didn't actually have to be the first flu you ever encountered. So a serious pandemic exposure in your early childhood, maybe that overrides other flus you encountered and you're still imprinted. And if that's true, it matters because it means there's more room for flu exposure to have been high before 1890, but still have a lot of older cohorts who might have still had some imprinting. And so it makes the parameters less high. So the conservative measure here is these black dots that are showing the refocusing rate is 0. No, to be imprinted, it actually had to be your first ever exposure. And actually, even with that restriction, the parameter rates are not, you know, they're not out of line with what other people have estimated as sort of realistic rates. So where does this leave us? We made these 5 attempts to knock this hypothesis down. None succeeded. I would not say that we have given you any evidence for this hypothesis. I would say that we have failed at giving you evidence against it. And so this is sort of our kind of last explanation left standing, along with that suggestive idea of behavioral responses to the spring wave that we're just, you know, kind of throwing out there. But stepping back, the imprinting hypothesis is interesting to me, partly because it offers this possibility of consilience between these 3 distinctive facts about 1918. And so if it's really about these early childhood exposures, then we potentially have a way to explain some of the virulence, the weird age pattern, and the strikingly small disparities all together as a package, which is pretty cool. But what I want to end with is just the framework that this gives us, which is that what happens in the pandemic reflects what was happening before the pandemic, but it does so mediated by the pandemic's specific biology. So there are a lot of reasons to care about history, but one that people often find compelling is that it should tell us something about the present or future. But all of these social immunology hypotheses actually are basically saying that this arresting fact about the last truly global respiratory pandemic, which is that it had these surprisingly small racial disparities in US cities, they're basically saying that it's just a big historical coincidence. So it's maybe the coincidence of how migration patterns that differed between white and non-white populations just happened to intersect with a shift in which viruses were circulating over an almost 30-year span. And so to me, this is really a cautionary tale about reading 1918 forward and assuming that there's some sort of universal path of pandemics that we're all on today, or that all pandemics interact with social inequality and reproduce social inequality in the same ways, or for that matter, even that racial group boundaries have the same meanings today that they did a century ago. The social immunology frameworks suggest that drawing historical analogies requires us to be really careful and really attentive to the details to understand how particular social histories of people intersect with the particular natural histories of microbes. So I will leave it there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Wrigley-Field, for that really great and informative talk. Looks like we have a few questions. Dr. Trayman, would you?
Sorry, did you call on me?
Yes.
Yes, okay. There was a very interesting book by John Barry, The Great Influenza, which was actually published in 2004. But one of the things he discusses is the way that the flu just ran through the military, based on a lot of very bad decisions by military leaders. And as you were talking, it struck me that, and now I have no idea to what extent military bases were existed in different cities. So maybe this has nothing to do with your results, but it did strike me that you're finding that the flu was particularly rampant among young people, together with the fact that basically Blacks were excluded from the military. Could that play any role in this?
Yeah, we wondered about this. I think it's a really good suggestion. We wondered also, especially if this might intersect with segregation, right? So the story would be like white populations bring in the flu from military bases, and then it spreads in the white population, but the Black population is protected by segregation. We did, at an early stage of this project, we got some data on military base proximity, which other studies have found is a predictor of total mortality. And we didn't find any signal with racial disparities. So we looked at that and then we kind of abandoned it. But I think, we ended up taking that out of the paper. And I think you're kind of making me think that that was probably a mistake, because this is a really plausible idea. And, I don't think that our test of it was like definitive, but we didn't find any sign that it was right.
Maybe raising it and saying that you've thought about it and that you have no evidence for it, and that therefore this plausible hypothesis can be dismissed, would be useful.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. Thank you. That's actually very helpful.
Awesome. Great. Thank you. Next, Dr. Ford, would you like to go?
Thank you. And thank you for the really intriguing talk. I really enjoyed it. My question really piggybacks on Don's, and that is this period was really critical in the United States because of things like immigration as well as internal migration. But, and you said it yourself, as the last great global pandemic. And so I really would like to hear more about World War I and, the global context, and whether or not there is anything besides just the location of bases. For instance, I think I was hearing bases within the United States, but more, maybe a broader speculation perhaps about the role of World War I in this.
Yeah, this is a good question. One thing it makes me think is that we have not done at all is that we should try to integrate more our city data with the military data from elsewhere, because we're really only measuring deaths that happen to people who are residing in cities at the time that they die. But also, like, big chunks of the male population are missing because they're elsewhere in the military. The general fact of small racial disparities in the pandemic has been shown with military data also. So it was also true on military bases where the Black population was often employed, sometimes in non-military roles like cooks and things like that, or non-soldier roles. So Auckland and Mama Loons did this really kind of nice deep dive into the data that's available from the military. And so the finding is reproduced there, but I think the question about who's missing from the cities and is in the military, and also the question about like, how does, we haven't said anything about how does the experience in the US intersect with the global experience of the pandemic and people bringing the virus from other countries or spreading it to other countries as well. I think that point is well taken. And so we should think more about how to situate what we're seeing in cities in the fact that they were in this kind of interchange with a pandemic that's happening all over the world.
Patrick, would you like to go?
Yes, thank you. It was a great talk. I have a question about the exposure to to the flu. I mean, you say it was very virulent. So, is there any estimate from infectious to fatality ratios as to how many people are really exposed? The reason I'm asking is I think when we think of racial disparities in infectious disease, one of the main drivers is exposure. But if we're dealing, I mean, the more virulent the disease the agent we're dealing with, I guess the more universal I would expect exposure to be, and maybe that would reduce some of the disparities.
Yeah, so there are some data on this, and I don't remember the stylized facts that I would like to be able to tell you, which is like the range of exposure rates. The one that's sticking out in my mind is, so all of the studies are from the fall months, because that's when people were paying attention to the flu, because that's when it was so deadly. And in that context, the estimate that Auckland and Momland make from insurance data is that case fatality rates were about 30% higher in non-white populations compared to white populations. So, but I think in general, like it was a very deadly flu, but it's not at all the case that like everyone who was exposed was going to die. And so, but I hear you also saying from the other side, like, well, we should also be thinking about if exposure was really ubiquitous, like, where is the action coming? Is the action in the exposure side, or is it in the resistance side? Because those imply very different things about what the mechanisms of disparities would be, which I think is actually, that's a very helpful framework. Obviously some of our hypotheses, particularly the city level effects, they're all about the exposure side. And, if we have reason to think that that was sort of irrelevant because everyone was going to be exposed, then maybe we could have dispensed with those a lot quicker. But I'm not sure if that's true, but this makes me definitely want to go back to some of those other studies and their data and see what we can say about that. Thank you.
Let's see, Dr. Ritz, go ahead.
Yes, thank you for a great talk, Elizabeth.
Thank
Coming
you.
from Europe, I'm thinking about, what it did in Europe in 1918, and of course, when you think about Europe, you have Britain as one of the national outliers in terms of registering everything for hundreds of years. So I'm wondering whether you could use some of the British national health data to actually confirm or refute some of these hypotheses. The question, of course, would be, is that so-called Russian flu really Russian, or was that in the US only, or would that also have affected Europe? And then, given that it did or didn't, you could hone in on, do you see the same effects there?
Yeah, the 1890 flu really was a global pandemic also. So in fact, some of the studies that established this idea of the imprinting mechanism as potentially driving the high mortality for young adults were studies using Canadian data. I don't know about British data specifically. So my sense overall of the imprinting data is that where people have looked at it does fit in a kind of surprisingly neat way with the age patterns of mortality. And so one way to think about what we're doing is kind of saying like, well, wait a minute, we have more ways to think about exposure, even without any direct measures of exposure in 1890, which I don't think we're going to have. We have more ways as demographers to think about exposure than just age. We can also think about like how rural or urban was where you are. And as you're saying, we can also think about where was the 1890 flu really predominant. We tried to look at find some kind of international data to see like, well, were there places where the 1890 flu was really not a big deal? And then we could look at immigration from those places. And we didn't figure out anything we could actually do there. But I think that the broader point about thinking more about geographic variation, not just in terms of urban versus rural, is really right.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have any additional questions? You can also feel free to leave any questions you may have in the chat. Well, if there are no other questions, we'd like to thank Dr. Wrigley-Field for the really great and informative talk today. And we'd like to also remind students to just stay on this link afterwards for the pro seminar. So thank you, Dr. Wrigley-Field.
Thank you all so much. These questions were genuinely really helpful, and I'm so glad to have gotten them.